1980s and in the 1980s. So maybe that's enough. Maybe I should stop here. But that's me.
Thank you, Tomasz. Tomasz, do you want to introduce yourself a minute? Yes. No. It's not, it's on your end, honey, not ours. Tomasz, you don't hear us at all?
Hello, guys. Is everything all right?
Yes, we hear you. Transatlantic communication. So Tomasz, how is Portugal, since we're waiting for
It's very sunny. It's pleasant compared to Warsaw, which is which is kind of miserable, cold, and also as you perhaps know from experience, the sky is overcast for about 3 months during winter, and you don't get a ray of sun almost. So Portugal is a very nice change for me. Yeah, I can see that you have light coming through the window, so that's
was a sunny day, yeah. It's cold, but at least there's perhaps a sense of hope that it's changing.
Yeah, there is that.
Porto or
so you guys have both read Swimming in the Dark and watched the film Operation Hyacinth.
This class has only done Operation Hyacinth.
Okay, I see.
Operation Hyacinth and Swimming in the Dark. Yeah. But this
I think Tomasz is back.
Oh. At least visually he's back.
Yes.
Okay, guys. Hello.
Hello, we hear you.
Okay, I think I'm good. Sorry, I'm a bit late. This is not me, but at least finally I'm here. So once again, sorry for being a bit late.
That's all right. So do you want to introduce yourself a minute, and then we'll open up to questions?
Okay, fantastic. So guys, I have no idea what Richard has already told about me. We met about a year ago. So when Richard was in Krakow, my name is Tomasz Pudłocki. I live in Poland for 42 years. As a matter of fact, yesterday was my birthday, 42nd. So no, in comparison to you, I'm quite old guy. But I'm still trying to do my best. I'm working at Jagiellonian University, but in the same time, I am native of Przemyśl, the border city with Ukraine. Probably you heard about the place, or even if you haven't heard about the place, you heard about the war. So I try to be quite active, also advocating Ukrainian cause right now.
So Presidential, which is where he's from, is about what, 10 miles from the border, something like that.
More or less, yeah.
Very
I'm
close.
better in kilometers, not in miles. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a cute little town, right by the border. And I was, Tomasz took me there, so I got to see that.
Yeah, Richard was having a lecture for our society in the local high school, and he was amazing, like always he is.
Okay, I'm not grading you, so you don't have to flatter me. It's okay. So I think maybe we can open it up for questions from the students first and see where the conversation goes. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
So don't be shy. It's just like talking to another professor. They're both professors. It's okay. Naomi, you're gonna be the brave first one.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Introduce yourself too when you come.
Hello, my name is Naomi, and I was just wondering how does masculinity translate in the LGBTQ community, and like how has it changed?
Mm-hmm. Tomasz, would you like to start from Warsaw perspective?
I'll try. I'll do my best. So, when I mentioned earlier before Thomas showed up that that I was doing this study on people who are kind of LGBTQ in Poland, but who remember what it was like to be an LGBTQ person in the 1970s or the 1980s. And one of the things that I kind of learned through those interviews was that a number of the men I spoke to, and most of those men were activists or former activists, people who were in their 70s or even older. And a number of those people, especially people of a generation that kind of came of age in the 70s in Poland, and who were gay men, they were very concerned in a negative way about gay men or homosexual men who appeared effeminate. They kind of objected, sometimes quite loudly or quite audibly in those interviews when asked by me or by my colleagues, what about drag, or what about people who kind of behaved in a campy fashion? What did you call each other? Did you use female names or female pronouns to refer to one another? Some of them reacted in this very negative way. They seemed to think that it was kind of contrary to the political cause of building a positive image of, gay men's identity in the eyes of others. And I think that was the main reason. Some of them said they felt simply disgusted by this kind of display of femininity by men. This wasn't so much the case with people who were considerably older, or men who were considerably older. So when I spoke to men who were in their 80s, who grew up in the 1950s or early 60s, they didn't seem to have that negative attitude, and neither do, I don't think, many younger people today. So speaking of changes in or as you said, translations in models of masculinity, that is one thing that I would I think want to point to, that there is this moment in the early days of activism in the 70s and the 80s when people who are then young men and activists, they are very concerned that one should appear to be masculine in a kind of stereotypical way.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you were asking, though? I mean, is this what you were hoping to?
Yes, yes, it was. Thank you so much, good sir.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Tomasz, did you want to chime in as well, or?
As a matter of fact, I could only say something from my perspective. So let's say my generation or my students. So I totally agree with Tomasz about the faces of many faces of masculinity of today. So I think we are living in a very peculiar times, which are absolutely great to research on, as a matter of fact. So I like very, very much that people are trying to be open up to many different phases of masculinity. Guys, just a moment ago, I was just browsing Queer PL. This is LGBTQ website, and one of the most important information from today is from Czech Republic, and one is nice, one is not so much. So let's say a guy who is a soccer player, Jakub Jantko, 27-old guy, he just came out, and you may say that Czech Republic is the most secular a country in Central Europe. So as a matter of fact, it shouldn't be a big deal. But apparently it is, because in the same time, the Polish Academy of Science a couple of months ago was asked to do research about acceptance of homosexual men among the families. And what is quite surprising, that according to this research, the Polish families are much more open to have a son, brother, whoever among themselves than the Czech families. Even we would say that stereotypically Poland is much more Catholic, and Czech Republic is probably the most is the country with the most people who are without any connections to any kind of religion. So what I'm trying to say, even if for the last 8 years a strike-ring party is ruling in Poland, I think the whole discourse about the public sphere, about the presence, about being who you are, is much more vivid, and that is why, let's say, there's many faces of, in this case, masculinity. And I can see it also among my students, whoever they are straight or not, or let's say they have many different faces of the whoever they are on, let's say it like that.
Thank you. Another question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Colin.
Hello.
My question is, we hear a lot of stories about the AIDS crisis in the United States. How is it different and how is it similar in a place such as Poland, especially during a time of communism?
Mm-hmm. Thomas, so maybe once again.
You want me to start? Okay, so
We hear a lot.
Sorry.
We hear a lot of stories about the AIDS crisis in the United States. How is it different and how is it similar in a place such as Poland, especially during a time of communism?
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Okay, so one of the things that I think perhaps is similar is that it took quite some time in Poland, as it did also in the US, and at least parts of the US, to kind of have information about HIV/AIDS disseminated when it first began. So as you probably know, the New York Times didn't actually publish an article about AIDS until quite late into the game, I think 1983, if I remember correctly. In Poland, similarly, there was relatively little information about HIV/AIDS until about the mid 80s. There weren't very many cases, so far as we know, partly because travel was restricted, and so people were not in contact, including in sexual contact with many people who kind of came from abroad. People didn't travel abroad so much because of the Iron Curtain and so on. But there was also very little information. And so one of the first underground gay zines, which began to be published in the second half of the 1980s in Poland, and in the first half of the 1980s abroad, but in Polish. There was one published in Vienna from 1983. They provided information to people who were, reading those zines about HIV/AIDS, about safer sex, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the government actually did. This is also the communist government at the time. It also provided care for people who had, who were sick with HIV/AIDS. They were given the medicine that was available. They were given medical care, including psychiatric or psychological care. So they would, for example, receive medication to make sure they're not depressed, and so on and so forth. So there was a relatively decent level of care, but it was all on a very small scale because the number of people who were diagnosed was limited. That's a kind of short answer to your question, I guess, about what it was like in the communist age to to be confronted with that. Having said that, as you probably know, the Operation Hyacinth was in part legitimated by the communist authorities on the logic that the homosexual group or the homosexual community was likely to spread HIV/AIDS, and that it needed to be monitored and controlled in some way. So there was also this kind of animosity, of course, that that was based on the idea that homosexuals are to blame for the spread of HIV/AIDS.
Thank you.
Mhm. If I may add something, so let's say I have only, let's say, 2 stories to add. So my personal story is my mother's story. My mother was a nurse in 1980s and 1990s. So as Thomas said, and I think this is very universal. So it was lack of information. So how to deal with the people. So even okay, she was not working in Krakow or in Warsaw, so not in the big places. It was a provincial hospital, very far away from the from metropolises. But first of all, it was a fear. Second, was lack of information, not a good training, and of course, everything changed at the very, very end of 1980s. Guys, if you'd like to get to know something more about the whole region, I don't know, have you ever seen a very good trilogy? It's a Swedish trilogy. I like both the novel and the movie. The novelist is Jonas Gardell, is a Swedish author, and the title is very peculiar, but I think you could like it very, very much. Don't ever wipe tears without gloves, which is, I think, is very, very touching, and it's not sentimental. Yeah, so it's on one hand is very striking. It's about life, it's about love, it's about passion, it's about sex. But on the other hand, it's also about dying and how to fight without dying. So on one hand, we have seen so much from American point of view. And I think Sweden in 1980s, at least from this movie, I like very much this Scandinavian cinema and Scandinavian novels is also giving us a bit different perspective. Yeah, so you have it all. And I think what is also important from this northern point of view, you have also Protestant churches perspective. Yeah, so sometimes we forget that in that time, so still in 1980s, a majority of the people in the region were quite religious, and very often LGBT community was victimized in that time. So strongly recommend this one. Yeah. So first of all, as Thomas said, something was done, no doubt, but of course it's up to the region, and you know it also from American point of view. And second, I could also try to focus your attention to, let's say, European cinema and European culture on the problem, which is absolutely amazing and a bit different than Australian or American.
Thank you so much.
Another question?
Hi, I'm Sierra.
Hello.
Do you believe that the anti-gay movement that increased during the Soviet era was an influence from the Soviet that like forced Poland into having the anti-gay movement as well? Or do you think that Polish leaders and communities like readily jumped on the movement on their own and were already headed in that direction, like due to their own prejudice?
It's a great question. Thomas, do you want to start this time or?
Okay, once again, be the
Okay.
first. I need to reflect a bit.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that question. Okay, so if you look at the Soviet bloc countries and the Soviet Union, right? I mean, it's a fairly complicated history in that the Soviet Union does not kind of start by by prosecuting homosexual people, and it actually kind of allows homosexuality at first, and then that changes with the arrival of Joseph Stalin. So fairly, even before the war, before Second World War, that's already a different ball game in the Soviet Union itself, where homosexuality becomes outlawed. In Poland, there is a new criminal code that was adopted in 1932. Poland was under partitions by its neighbors, by Russia, Austria, and Germany, or Prussia, until the First World War, and it only regained independence in 1918. It had a very complicated legal situation because it was territories that used to belong to 3 different countries for more than 100 years. So you had to kind of make sure that the laws were coordinated in a new way. And that was done successively by new laws being adopted. And in 1932, Poland adopted a new criminal code, which covered the whole territory of Poland. And this code was quite progressive, and it did not criminalize homosexuality. It kind of left that it was silent on the subject of homosexuality, with one exception. It outlawed homosexual prostitution. Okay, so prostitution was legal except for same-sex prostitution, and this pattern, this kind of laxity or relative laxity when it came to how the law treated same-sex acts, was kept in place also after World War II. In other words, when Poland came under Soviet influence after World War II, and the communist government was installed, they kept that they kept the regulations of that criminal code as far as homosexuality was concerned. And so homosexuality was not outlawed in Poland, and has not been since the end of World War I and the adoption of this new criminal code by the newly independent Republic of Poland. But that's not really the whole story, because you do have, of course, as I said, you had animosity towards people with HIV/AIDS, and you had animosity and ostracism and forms of persecution of people who were homosexual. Again, the film that you saw kind of documents that. And the basis for this, police activity wasn't because homosexuality was illegal. It was legal, but there were other laws, such as, for example, laws which regulated improper sexual conduct in public, which would have been used, and so on and so forth. My sense is that the main impetus for ostracism and kind of negative attitudes towards homosexuality did not necessarily come from the Soviet Union. They came from a kind of traditional outlook on sexuality that was part of the Catholic upbringing of most people in Poland. It was just something that seemed a matter of course to most people, that homosexuality was a bad thing, was an evil thing, and that didn't necessarily have political motivations until the 1980s. The Catholic Church, by the way, also did not speak out on homosexuality until the arrival of HIV/AIDS. That's the moment when the Catholic Church, not just in Poland, in fact, begins to kind of be outspoken against homosexuality. Before that, it was just not an issue. I mean, of course, homosexuality was considered a sin and so on, but it wasn't something that that was kind of on the agenda in a very visible way for the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, before HIV/AIDS. So it's really with the advent of HIV/AIDS that this becomes a kind of visible and political thing, that this question of homosexuality. And in Poland, there isn't very much activism around LGBTQ issues until that moment, in part because there is no penalization of same-sex acts. So this very major motivation that is there for activists in other countries, to depenalize, decriminalize same-sex acts, that did not exist in Poland. And of course, at the same time, you had a kind of culture of silence, a taboo around homosexuality. And also, on top of that, the communist government was very intolerant of any grassroots activism. Okay, so it wasn't just homosexuals, but any group that would have liked to like establish itself and conduct campaigns or just hold meetings, that they would have been investigated and probably suppressed in some way.
I totally
Tomasz, go
agree.
ahead.
So let's say, yeah. So if we are speaking about minorities, it was the same story with the national minorities. So the whole idea was in communist Poland, but it was not only Poland, that it was one minority. So let's say Ukrainians or the Germans. So they were allowed to have only one organization. Yeah, so it was the whole pattern covering everything, yeah, in the same time. But guys, I would like also to say that in 1920s and 30s, even if, as Tomasz just said, it was this culture of science, in the same time, Warsaw was a very flourishing center. And you can read something more about it from Kamil Karczewski's articles, whose PhD in Florence is absolutely amazing. And I hope it will come up very soon as a book. He's a student of Peter Judson, and what he has done for the last couple of years is like decoding and rewriting LGBT story in Poland. So not only individuals, yeah, because we have known so much about particular individuals. So let's say what I'm trying to say, even in communism Poland, there were members of parliaments like Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz. Everybody knew that he was at least bisexual, but let's say it was like a public secret. So I think, let's say, if you try to compare it with American point of view, so it was like this policy: don't ask, don't tell. Yeah, so everybody knew that. Even there is a kind of museum not so far away from Warsaw about Iwaszkiewicz, but it was like a public secret. So let's say one of the most important novelist, Maria Dąbrowska. It's another story, so everybody knew that, and she was also a member of the parliament in 1940s and 50s. Yeah, so we are speaking about the people in a public. We are not speaking about people who are somewhere in secret. But of course, lots of people were just denying. No, definitely not. He was married because she had just a friend. And what I think is important also to add, that 1968, so let's say from your perspective, is sexual revolution, it was almost not visible in Poland or in broader, let's say, the Soviet bloc. So it was not like a very important boost for the people to somehow to show up to do something. Let's say still the end of 1960s. This is very gray part. I think 1970s. This is something different. So I think I would also try to show that there were different decades. Yeah. So let's say I do love 1920s and 30s. Very much, so let's say, from this bigger perspective. Kamil Karczewski, in his latest article for London, he also proved that if you were living in a very distant provincial place, like a village, it was not so bad as we thought it was. Yeah, because as Tomasz said, LGBT community was not pointed out as a very important enemy. There were other enemies of that time. So let's say, and of course, this is also connected with the discourse of reproduction. With all respect, it was not an issue in 1920s and 30s. There were so many young children in Poland, so nobody cared. This is totally, then we try to compare it with the situation of, let's say, for the last 8 years, when we can see that the demography is definitely in crisis. That is why the current government is always taking it into the ground. So just a small part to add.
Thank you.
Did you understand that last part about demographics?
Yes, so like the people in the village, they did not have such like a hostile reaction to homosexuals because they were not taught that homosexuals were an important enemy. And then the second one was because reproduction wasn't a problem because there was a child boom. So they're like, okay, you could not have kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to now, with graphic of the government.
Okay, so maybe this time, so if you are speaking about Kamil Karczewski, so guys, I can strongly recommend Karczewski's articles. Richard, if you don't mind, I can send you some references, and you can also share. Because definitely Kamil is among, let's say, people in their 30s who's doing really good job, and he was trained outside. Surprisingly, we have also the same story for Budapest. So whatever Viktor Orban is trying to say to us, don't listen to him. And of course, we've known so much about Russia, even if Mr. Putin is trying to denounce it. So first, so Karczewski is writing also about the villages, countryside in 1920s and 1930s. Of course, it was totally different mentality. So we are not speaking that people were openly living together, I know, walking through the streets or the fields and feeling totally free. But you can see that there were sometimes it was much easier, I think, than, let's say, 1980s, as Tomasz just said. Yeah, so there were the different situation, and of course sometimes it's important just to show that there are our gay people and outsiders. Yeah, so our people, so we've known them, they're a bit different, but they are hardworking, they are living among us, they are friendly, sometimes they are taking care of our, I know, cattle, friends, elderly people, etc., etc. So I think this a figure of our and stranger is, I think, is also important when we are speaking about the small communities. And I think we can see it also for the last couple of years, when all of a sudden the mayors of villages, sometimes in Pomerania, sometimes Western Poland, sometimes even Central Poland, all of a sudden they are coming out. And it's not a big deal. With all respect, it's not a big deal. Sometimes I think they feel much better, they feel much safer than people living in bigger places like Warsaw or Wrocław. So this is what I would say. I don't know, Tomasz, what is your perspective?
I think that I think that there is, of course, in like queer studies in Poland, and not just in Poland, there is kind of traditionally a very strong emphasis on cities, and this has been criticized, as metronormativity, etc. I think the reason for this focus on cities is to do with visibility. It is to do with media, with technologies of communication, with the fact that people in cities kind of find it easier to group together and be visible because they form a group that is visible. And in the countryside, this is simply less so. But I think agree with the general point that you were making, that there is not much evidence that homophobia is any stronger in villages or in the countryside, in the rural areas, than it is in urban spaces in Poland. And from my personal experience, I would say that is certainly the case. I spent almost every summer for the last 20 years. I spent every summer in a small village with my partner, and we've never had a kind of homophobic encounter of any kind. So there is a kind of fear among city people in Poland, in any case, that if you go to the countryside, and you're gay, you're going to get attacked or something. That I don't think that happens very much. I don't think that happens. It has never happened to me or to anyone I know. So whereas people in cities are attacked, so it's sometimes. So it's yeah, it's, even though you don't have the same level of visibility of people who are gay in the countryside, they don't necessarily advertise themselves so much or are talked about in the media so much. That is changing, as you were saying. I mean, there are those local community leaders or local politicians who are openly gay now in rural areas in Poland. One of the people whom I interviewed for the project I mentioned, someone who was growing up in the 70s, he told me that gay man. He told me that he never came out to his parents, who were farmers in a village, because he believed they had no concept of homosexuality, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if he was right about this necessarily, but he believed that that there was no point in talking to them about his life because they were just too naive. They had no knowledge that something like that something such as homosexuality existed even. So there's also that kind of belief, I think, that's widespread about the I don't know if ignorance is the right word, but the kind of innocence, of the people in the villages, which strikes me as being naive in its own way, actually. But that's something that I've encountered as well.
And I think if I may add something, so let's say if you are speaking about this concept of being gay in the public sphere, so what was important that openly you are not stressing, or let's say you are not saying, you are not giving anything, any kind of notice. So guys, as a matter of fact, for the last couple of years, I'm doing some religious studies, and as a matter of fact, I'm very surprised about the percentage of bishops who were gay and who are very, very important for our national, not even Catholic story or religious story, but about our national story. And almost nobody was interested. Nobody was interested in the homosexuality, even if it was known for the people, let's say, in the first half of 20th century. So it was not a big deal, as long as they were not saying it openly, because first of all, they were priests, second, because they were patriots, third, because very often they were very important orators, they were having very important seats, and of course, it was not a scandal, so what was important, that it was not a scandal, so they did not have any kind of scandalous life outside, so everything more or less was covered, so, and of course, the good question is, if we knew so much, so why, let's say, John Paul II didn't decide to do anything about the gay priests, why Benedict all of a sudden decided to do something about it legally? So this is another case. So, and I think that is why also in these rural areas, people could just move on if they were not openly stressing. So they could have a kind of a partner, smaller, or let's say long-term relationship, or not so long, but it was nothing extraordinary. And of course, what is also important for the rural area, that they were all also a kind of a freaks, in quotation marks. So let's say people who had something to do with medicine, but they were not officially doctors of medicine. People who were not nurse, but they were do something with a kind of a witchcraft. So let's say gay people, whatever the gender, they were also a kind of another freaks among the freaks. And a rural area, on one hand, this is a wonderful area, very conservative, but on the other hand, these are our people, and that is why they should be protected. The strangers, let's say from another village, from the cities, this is something different. But if the person is our, it's something different.
When you say the R, does that mean like it's okay
Like from
in
their
our
community.
Yeah,
Because they know them, because it's
Yeah,
familiar.
because they are known. That's right. Yeah, because they, yeah.
Hi, I'm Marissa.
Hello, Marissa.
Hi, just like with talking about the idea of our people versus outsiders, just like in a little different context, I was wondering if there was ever a unified mentality in coordinated protests from queer people in Poland, and if not, why do you think it wouldn't have been successful at the time?
Tomasz, would you mind?
I just want to clarify, Marissa, are you asking about the present, or are you asking about the past? And if about the past, then what moment in the past?
Specifically, kind of what was that 80s, I believe, mid 80s? Yeah. And mid 80s.
So you're asking why there wasn't like a strong unified movement of LGBTQ people in Poland in the 1980s. Yeah, so I addressed this in part already by saying that there are at least three reasons that I can think of, and I'll just repeat them now quickly. One is there was no penalization of same-sex acts. This, the fact of such penalization was a very strong motivator for activists in other countries. That did not exist in Poland. That's one reason. Another is the Polish government, the communist government in Poland, generally for kind of limited the freedom of assembly. Okay, so you had laws which made it very difficult for people to create grassroots, to organize in a grassroots manner. Okay, anything that was kind of not supervised or not initiated by the authorities was problematic and was suspect and was often denied the right to be registered with the courts, for example, as a formal association, and so on and so forth. So that's another reason. There is this kind of political difficulty of freedom of assembly. And the third reason is that there is this strong taboo on homosexuality, so that as Tomasz was saying, in many instances it was kind of okay to be gay so long as you never came out, or only came out to other gay people. So that there was this kind of tacit understanding, a very conservative mindset, which prevailed in many communities, not just rural communities, but in many families, many kind of like job situations and so on. And so there was a kind of cultural barrier to people coming out and becoming active in this way. So I would say those three things combined, and this was the case up until the mid 80s, more or less.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, I'm Sarah.
Hello?
Hello.
My question is, what has Poland accomplished in regards to the treatment of gay people since the end of communism, and what do they still need to do?
Mm-hmm. Tomasz, do you want to take that one?
Would you mind starting?
No. Okay, so one of the things that happened with the end of communism was that there was a kind of explosion of commercial undertakings which catered to gay people. One of those things that kind of became available where they had not been available previously was gay magazines. You could just go to a newsstand and get like a, like one of several titles that was published. Most of those titles were addressed to gay men as opposed to women, but many of them, or at least some of them, had columns which were addressing lesbian women. Trans people were not very visible yet in the early 90s. We're talking about the early 90s right now. Another thing that happened was that you had gay bars, you had clubs. Again, usually they were catering to gay men, but some of them had like a lesbian night, and this was new. Previously, there were ways for gay people, usually gay men, to meet, including some cafes or bars, but they were not dedicated to the gay clientele. They were kind of like, gay friendly and in a only partly open manner. So this is one big change, and that of course helped people to associate and kind of develop a sense of themselves as gay, because they could read about being gay and they could also get in touch with others. There were lots of personal ads in those early zines. This is before the era of dating apps and internet and so on. Most of those magazines actually folded. I mean, all of them folded. They don't exist anymore, except for one, which was established more recently. And this is partly because both explicitly or sexually explicit material and personal, ads had been kind of replaced by what is available to us online. So that's one of the biggest changes that took place. Another is that gay organizations could be officially registered, and literally dozens of them were registered very, very soon after the transition of 89. Okay, so in the early 90s, you had like a proliferation of gay organizing. And again, many of those organizations, they only lasted for a year or two or three. There's only a couple that continue to be active nowadays from the ones that were established in the early 90s. And there are new ones, of course. which are active. So that's another huge change, that you could organize in an official way. You could have posters in the streets, maybe. Another thing that was done because of this was gay marches. Gay marches did not exist in the 1980s or under communism. They started in the early 2000s, essentially, and they are today, kind of organized in many towns or cities across Poland every year. What those developments did not bring about is any significant change in the legal status of homosexuals in Poland. Okay, so you have only, I mentioned previously that the criminal code did not penalize homosexuality except for same-sex prostitution. This proviso, this exception, this penalization of same-sex prostitution was actually removed by the communists in the late 1960s. And the only other change in the law which concerns homosexuality directly that was ever adopted was in the labor code. Poland was expected or required by the European Union to implement or to add to the labor code a clause which stated that discrimination on the basis of sexuality is illegal in order for Poland to be able to access the European Union. So before Poland joined the European Union in 2004, I think it was, Poland had to adopt this change in the labor code. And this change, this new clause in the labor code remained inactive in the sense that it wasn't typically used by anybody, or the courts did not recognize claims based on this clause in the law until quite recently. Okay, so that's changing today. What has not happened is any regulation such as, for example, defining crimes due to homophobia as a special category of crimes. This is something that the activists are demanding, and that has not happened. Another thing that has not happened, of course, is the recognition of same-sex couples. We have no recognition of same-sex couples whatsoever, at least not explicitly. In other words, you cannot be married to a same-sex partner. You cannot even have a registered partnership with someone of the same gender. The courts occasionally recognize de facto partnership in the context of inheritance, for example. So there are some ways in which the practice of decisions taken by the courts begin to recognize same-sex partners, but that's something that has only begun to happen relatively recently, and there is no legislative change in this respect, right? There is no new law adopted which kind of recognizes that. So I think what needs to happen is that those legal changes need to be implemented. I'm not sure how this is going to happen. I mean, with the current right-wing government, this is completely unlikely. At the same time, attitudes in Poland have been changing in favor of LGBTQ community, at least in favor of lesbians and gay men. I think it's a little more complicated with people who are transgender or non-binary, but attitudes are changing in favor of recognizing same-sex couples in some way. The adoption of children by same-sex couples is much more of a kind of contested issue. Another thing worth mentioning in this context is that I said that the situation of trans people is more complicated. What I mean by this primarily is that there is a lot of prejudice against trans people among people who are kind of, older. Tomasz said he's old or older. I'm even older. So our generation, I think, has a problem with that. But statistically, I don't mean myself necessarily, but statistically, people of our age. Whereas if you look at people who are teenagers, people who are school kids today, they do not seem to have any problem with that. They often kind of tell their parents off when the parents question, is your friend a boy or a girl? And, my niece told her mom, what kind of question is that? They don't use that, those gender pronouns anymore. So that's a very rapid change that's taking place. And it's very interesting to see. By the way, another very rapid change which is taking place in Poland right now is that there is a very fast pace of secularization again among the young people. Okay, so there are very few churchgoers and very few children or school kids who attend religious education classes. Poland introduced religious education to public schools after 89, kind of modeling this on what used to be the case in the interwar period before the advent of communism. And this kind of forced everyone more or less into religious education. You could opt out, but it wasn't easy. And you may have been looked down upon if you did. Nowadays, it's the reverse. At least in big cities, the kids don't want to go to religious classes. They refuse to go. Their parents don't want them to go, and so on and so forth. That's very new. So there is this very fast pace of secularization. There is this among the young people in any case, and also this very fast pace of change in terms of attitudes towards the LGBTQ community. But once again, this has not translated into legislative changes at this point, at least.
If I may add something, so I think a kind of a counter reaction is what just Thomas said, as a kind of a counter reaction for the government's doing. Yeah, so the public discourse is very right wing and conservative, and probably that is why it's such a influx of many different actions. Yeah, so let's say surprisingly. I think, Tomasz, you can make me, you can prove me wrong, that I think for the last 8 years, the number of the gay parades, I think, or LGBTQ parades, I think is doubled or even tripled when you try to compare it with the situation before 2015. Yeah, so let's say I remember when the very first time LGBTQ parade was in Rzeszów. So let's say the region I'm from. This is the regional capital. And as a matter of fact, I had American colleagues from Damon College in that time. So of course, for them, it was much more interesting to see counter parade. Yeah, so this striking supporters just following the march. But of course, nothing happened. It was quite peaceful. But let's say I felt somehow probably much more terrified than they did. So what is quite surprising that for the last 8 years, even in a very small places, all of a sudden we can see the parades. So as Thomas just said, it's totally different. And I think the more government is putting pressure on education, new curricula at school, new idea how the education at school should look like, I think this is this huge counterattack. I think even more, those people who are even religious, but they are not following the teaching of the church if we are speaking about sexuality. So this is, let's say, like two different spheres. Yeah, so officially, even if people attend the masses or liturgy every single Sunday, unofficially they claim that they are not supporting this kind of teaching. So first, if you are speaking about 1990, so let's say 2004, let's say why 2004, because as Thomas said, for us it's important because 10 countries of Europe joined EU. Yeah, so this is not only Poland, but let's say another 9. So I think this is also a kind of a different trick and a different shift in economy, a wonderful area of consumerism, pros and cons, of course. And I remember I was a high school student of that time. Tomasz, I don't know what is your story, but I do remember my very first time when I was buying magazine. And guys, you can ask Richard. Przemyśl is not a big place. It's only 60,000 inhabitants, and I still can point it out the kiosk I bought the magazine, and it was not covered. You could see it immediately. You could see it. Yeah, you can see the guy on the cover. Of course, I was terrified somehow. I remember when I was, let's say, a high school student. I was to write an essay about my favorite book, and my favorite book of that time was Cyril Collard, Savage Knights, which was very, let's say, progressive in that time. So what I'm trying to say that, let's say, this kind of translations, okay, in this case we are speaking Cyril Collard, this is French novelist translated into Polish. So 1990s are extremely interesting because all of a sudden you have totally different economy, lots of people collapsed, lots of people lost jobs, everything it was totally crazy. But in the same time, it was free market, and we were flooded with new magazines, new media, new access to information. People were traveling here and there, even unsuccessfully, but all of a sudden they could go to Germany, and it was not DDR, so Eastern Germany, so communist Germany, but all of a sudden it was one united Germany, or let's say it was not Czechoslovakia, it was Czech Republic. And you know that Prague was always one of the most important LGBTQ center in Central Europe. If you don't believe me, just go and see on your own. So I think this is also important, but as Tomasz said, not in the light of legal process. Yeah. So what I would say is that 2010, so Smolensk catastrophe, this is one of the most important factor if we are speaking about the change of mentality. Tomasz, I don't know what about you, but I had the feeling, maybe I'm naive, that let's say more or less 2010, I had a kind of a feeling that we are moving west, yeah, from the mental point of view, that sooner or later probably it would even fasten some changes. After 2010, everything more or less collapsed. Yeah, so we were just put in a path that a huge catastrophe happened, that there is Russia or whoever was to blame, of course, in quotation mark. And that is why also it was this mental shift for the next 10 years to come. And I think for the last 2 years, as Tomasz just said, we are facing a new shift, and I think we could stay in this path a bit longer.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Luke.
Hello.
Hello.
In what ways is the current gay community in Poland unique? What qualities differentiates them? You kind of addressed this in a couple of key ways already, but I still wanted to ask.
Today, uniqueness of...
Yeah, today.
Is it somehow, Tomasz? Do you believe so?
It's very good. That's a complicated question. I don't know that I can answer it well. Yeah, so you know, there is this is something that is like an ongoing debate about does the movement in Poland, does the community in Poland constantly imitate the ways in which such movements and communities operate in other countries, especially in Western Europe and also in the US? Or is there somehow a kind of you know, local inspiration or local inventiveness? It's a tough question. I mean, my sense is that it's very difficult to kind of disentangle the influences from the local initiatives. And there is a recent book by a friend of mine whose name is Łukasz Schulz, who works in the UK, which has the word, I can't remember the title exactly, it's called Transnational Homosexuals in Communist Poland, I think. Transnational Communists in transnational homosexuals in communist Poland, and he writes, for example, about how the early Polish gay zines were were getting support from zines or magazines in the West, or how the early organizations, LGBTQ organizations in Poland, cooperated with organizations in West European countries usually, and how they were kind of learning how to, you know, do this kind of activism. So there is certainly a lot of kind of knowledge sharing and exchange of ideas that is responsible for the rise of LGBTQ activism in Poland from a very early moment on. So, for example, I mentioned this already. One of the first The first gay zine that we know of, which was published in the early 1980s, was published out of Vienna. It was published by a Polish person who had left Poland and moved to Vienna, but it was nevertheless, kind of published out of Vienna, and there was support from the local gay organization for this, and so on and so forth. So, so it's a very tough question. There is, if you look, for example, at artwork in the first Polish gay zine published out of Poland, which was called Philo. It was published in Gdańsk, which is a seaport in northern Poland. They have, it was a very simple operation. It wasn't very sophisticated, no color photographs or anything like that. It was just like it looks like a Xerox, something copied with a simple copier. But they have quite interesting and innovative or inventive artwork to illustrate, for example, what safer sex means. Okay, they had like stick figures drawn and so on and so forth. A lot of this seems very original. At the same time, if you look at activism by local communities or local activists in the US, for example, they also used stick figures to illustrate safer sex practices in their leaflets. So it's really hard to know sometimes, whether something kind of is a spontaneous idea that came to someone in Poland under communism, and they had little contact with the outside world because of the Iron Curtain and so on and so forth, or whether on the contrary, someone handed them a leaflet, or someone had traveled abroad and someone had brought back their materials and so on and so forth. A very difficult question to answer. I don't really have an answer. And the same continues to be the case today. I mean, I think a lot of the local organizing in Poland is kind of constantly in communication with organizers or activists in other countries. So it's a very tough question. In terms of, I mean, I don't think you're asking just about activism, but I think the same can be said about other forms of cultural expression. So if you think of like gay clubs and drag shows and so on and so forth, of course we have drag shows which are by local artists or local performers. Do they also know about performers in other countries? Of course they do, right? I'm sure they go to drag shows in London or Berlin or Amsterdam or wherever. So so there's this constant exchange, and I think this constant exchange was also the case in the 20s and the 30s, which Tomasz talked about earlier. In other words, before the onset of communism, and that is something that has kind of returned with the fall of the Iron Curtain. It became easier to travel and to have contacts across borders. Yeah, so sorry if this is not a straightforward answer, but I don't think I can give a straightforward answer to this question.
That's perfectly fine.
Okay, if I may add something, so I totally agree with Tomasz. I would just give you two spheres. So first, if you are speaking of a public sphere, I remember two important exhibitions. One was in Krakow, one was in Warsaw. So it was 2004. I just graduated with Jagiellonian, so it was Igor Mitoraj public exhibition. Igor Mitoraj was one of the most important Italian sculptor. You can find his pieces all over Europe, but especially in Italy. But what is interesting that his sculptures are either half nude or totally nude. Yeah, so it was I think especially for conservative Krakow, when you have a huge exhibition not only in the museum but also outside in our marketplace, which is the biggest in Europe, as a matter of fact. So it was something, yeah. So all of a sudden you have the guys, wonderful sculptures with penises, nothing covering, yeah. So they were still ahead of Mitoraj in the marketplace, but all these sculptures were just put in the marketplace. So I think it was important. And all of a sudden the people were saying, oh, with all respect, Mitoraj is not an Italian, he's also Polish. Yeah. So all of a sudden that we have some kind of traditions of LGBTQ artists even if we thought we didn't have. So first. Second, Tomasz, I don't know about what is your experience of this very important 2010 exhibition in National Museum in Warsaw, which was called Art Homo Erotica, which I think was also very, very crucial and probably the only exhibition on a such big scale. Please prove me wrong. And I think it was also a big deal. Let's say I was 30 in that time, and I was really, really smitten and even proud that it was a kind of continuity, that we are not alone, that this is not, let's say, 1980s or, I know, some individuals in the past, but this is a very nice long tradition, somehow rooted also in European, or let's say the world movement. So this is first. So I think we can also see a very important events, even if not, even if the past, and let's say for the last couple of years, I do not recall any important public event connected with culture, so like art or a museum. So this is first. Second, guys, I would like to give you a bit your attention to Ukraine. A couple of years ago, your colleagues from Damon College were in Przemyśl and also in Lviv. And they asked me about any kind of LGBTQ club in Lviv, which was in that time more or less about 800,000 inhabitants. So it was, let's say, like a second Polish city. It was almost like as big as Krakow. And such a big place, Western Ukraine, very close by to Poland, officially nothing. Like really nothing. Okay, online you can meet some people to hook up, no problem, but nothing like officially. What do we have a couple of years later when it was this Eurovision? You can like this European song contest or not. You can say that this is cliche, or this is just this is kind of a nightmare, or you can like it very much. Doesn't really matter. But it was in Kiev. It was, let's say, very semi LGBT, yeah. So almost officially, LGBT movement was confirmed. When I'm saying about it, because when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was almost a year ago. Immediately after, lots of soldiers, male and female, they said, okay, we are LGBT community members, but in the same time, we are soldiers. And we are fighting for Ukraine, but we are in the same time, we are fighting for our rights. So I think the Ukrainians are the very first who are trying to say that on one hand, we are LGBT members, but this is also our fatherland, this is also our homeland. And we are fighting also for the rights. And President Zelensky, at least he promised to do something with the legal system in Ukraine because of this great men and women and who is a soldier there, because they are stressing that they are proud members of the community. And I think this is a very nice example for us living in a peaceful lands, yeah, because we think that this is only theory and we can just take our LGBT movement out of something else. For them, is one big issue. So sorry for taking also Ukraine into the field, but I think we cannot forget about them and about what they are doing today.
If I may just quickly say, and I like that you've included Ukraine. In case you don't know this, Zelensky, of course, long before he became president of Ukraine, as you know, he was an actor, a performer. He did perform in drag, and you can find this on YouTube if you just Google it. So I recommend maybe having a look at if you're interested.
All right, thank you very much.
So it's 6 hours later where they are, and I think it would be only fair to let them get some rest. So thank you both for talking to us today, and I look forward to seeing you again in person rather than virtually. And if you would like to say thank you as well.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. Yes, it was great to see everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. See you very soon in Buffalo.
Yes.
And I look forward to seeing you in Warsaw, Richard, I hope.
I hope so, very soon, yes.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Bye bye, guys.
Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.